Harlem is one of the most famous neighborhoods, not just in New York, but in the entire country. Out-of-towners know it, people overseas know it. Once, it was home to large Jewish and Italian populations, but today, it's Black Mecca. So, how did some old Dutch farmlands turn into one of the most recognized neighborhoods for Black culture in the world? Well, let's get into today's story. In 1899, a 23-year-old black man named Philip Anthony Payton Jr. moved to New York City against his parents' wishes. Philip's father was a barber, and his mother was a hairdresser up in Massachusetts. Growing up, Philip's father had always told him that it was wise to learn a trade because it would be easier to find work. So, when he was younger, Philip would go to school, and then twice a week he would train with his parents to work as a barber. By the time he was 15, he claimed to be a full-fledged barber. Now, it just so happened that Philip's father was good friends with Dr. Joseph Charles Price, who many have compared to Booker T. Washington as far as great black orators are concerned. Dr. Price was a founder and the first president of Livingstone College, which is a historically black college in North Carolina. Philip was able to enroll in this college, and he graduated in 1899. His father thought it would be a great idea to get a college-level education, but his plan was for Philip to continue working in the family barbershop. Philip did do that until 1899, but he wanted a greater purpose in life, and he thought the best way to find out what that was to move to New York. Immediately, he was able to find work in Harlem, and he did so in 3 different fields. He worked in a department store, he worked as a barber, and he also worked as a porter in a real estate office, so basically just cleaning. But while he worked this last job, he was able to really get a feel for what happened in the real estate business, and he thought it might be advantageous to create his own firm. He was earning about $20 per week doing all 3 of these jobs, which was right around $750 today. This was above average pay for the time period, so Philip said, you know what, I'm going to do it. I'm going to open my own real estate office, and he did. He got himself a partner, and they opened up shop. But the partnership lasted less than a year, and the business was unsuccessful. He did marry shortly after that, and he was able to turn everything around, but in order to understand the transition of Harlem, it'll help if we go back to the beginning. If we go back to the days of Dutch rule, we're talking mid-1600s here, there was one main road that connected New Harlem to New Amsterdam. In case you didn't know, Harlem is named for a Dutch city. That road, by the way, is now called Broadway. But without that road, there was no connection to New Amsterdam for New Harlem. It truly was like these were 2 separate cities. A few settlements were established, but if we fast forward to the American Revolution, the British burned Harlem down to the ground. It took a long time to rebuild, and for the longest time, it just became farmland, which was eventually split up by the Manhattan grid system that was created in 1811. With more roads now connecting the growing city to the south, money was able to make its way up to Harlem thanks to these farms. Beginning in the 1830s, tenement apartments had to start going up due to an expansion of the New York and Harlem Railroad. By 1880, the 2nd Avenue and 3rd Avenue railroads are making their way up to Harlem as well, so there was this growing need for apartments. Most of the businesses were still in Lower Manhattan, but rent prices were too high for many. And even though the trains weren't super speedy, many thought it could be worth it to take the extra long commute in exchange for a lower rent price. Remember, most people are working 6 days and 12 hours a day at that point. Nevertheless, they were still willing to spend 2 hours on the train every day to lower the cost of living. Plus, a lot of the tenements downtown were getting very overcrowded. And with a number of disease outbreaks throughout the years, an escape to the north really didn't seem like a bad idea. The populations that started to take over Harlem for the second half of the 19th century were mostly Jews, Italians, Germans, and Irish immigrants, all turning Harlem into a suburb, more or less. Oscar Hammerstein even built the Harlem Opera House in 1889 on West 125th Street. His grandson, Oscar Hammerstein II, became one of Broadway's most influential lyricists and book writers. Harlem was now a destination as well, and 10 years later, our friend Philip Payton Jr. came to town. After some of these initial struggles that Philip faced became his reality, a different reality was coming to Harlem. Just like the east side of Harlem saw train lines turn it into a hotspot, the Interborough Rapid Transit was coming to Harlem as well. The IRT was New York City's original underground subway line. Well, if that's true, then certainly West Harlem should develop the same exact way that East Harlem did, right? That's the way that the developers saw it anyway. So these speculative builders wasted no time and began saturating West Harlem with these lucrative apartment houses. Since East Harlem was filled with low-rent tenements, these builders figured why not go for a more luxurious approach to the new buildings. This included marvelous brownstones and row houses. They'd have these marble mantels and parquet floors. And then in 1904, the subway did in fact open in Harlem. And wouldn't you know it, nobody was coming. This ended up being a straight-up bust for the developers. At this point, Philip had gone back in business for himself, and he saw a little bit of moderate success. But when all of these other buildings were failing to fill up, he saw an opportunity to help his own people. Despite how the Civil War ended, New York was still a racist city. Black families were constantly being kicked out of their homes and moved to undesirable places. And right around the time of this real estate bust in Harlem, black families were settled further downtown around the Herald Square region. But they were being booted from their homes once more thanks to the almighty department stores like Macy's and Gimbel's. Residential buildings were being completely demolished, and these black residents needed somewhere to go. On June 15, 1904, Philip chartered the Afro-American Realty Company with an intention to do something about the race problem black New Yorkers were facing. He appealed to black investors and was able to raise enough money where he could begin purchasing some of these tenements. He filled these buildings with black families against the wishes of their neighbors. And then the following year, the Hudson Realty Company, which was a white-owned real estate company, they bought land on West 135th Street, smack in the middle of Harlem. They even bought a few of the neighboring buildings from Afro-American Realty, but immediately they kicked out these black families and replaced them with white families. Philip saw what happened and knew he had to act fast. So naturally, he bought the buildings right next door, kicked out the white families living there, and replaced them with black families. The Hudson Realty Company was furious about this because now these white families that had just moved into their new building were cranky about living next to these black families and threatened to leave. The Hudson Realty Company had no choice but to sell the buildings back to the Afro-American Realty Company at a huge loss. After seeing this, investors began flocking to Philip. He approached landlords that were struggling to make ends meet because of this oversaturation of real estate, and he asked them a simple question. Would you rather continue to lose money or have a full building, but the tenants are black? Sounds like an easy answer, but there were plenty of racist landlords who were not able to swallow their own prejudices and lost a ton of money. But others agreed if Philip could put his money where his mouth was. After all, how were low-income black families supposed to afford living in these spacious Harlem homes? The easy answer was they couldn't. But Philip was able to convince these families that they'd have a nice, spacious home that they could afford if they were willing to sublet an extra room or two to another family, which means you would now have multiple families living in the same apartment, just like some of the tenements in downtown Manhattan. But these would be much larger, and it was turning into more and more of a black neighborhood. And Philip did this over and over again, quickly morphing Harlem into a Black Mecca. A great sense of community came from all of these black families being right up on top of each other. Then in 1920, as Jim Crow laws were upheld in southern states, the Great Migration was pushing black families to the larger cities in the Northeast. And New York found itself home to about 150,000 black people, and 100,000 of them lived in Harlem. Philip had earned the nickname the Father of Harlem. Any of these iconic landmarks you find scattered all around the Harlem neighborhood can trace their roots right back to the culture created by Philip. Unfortunately, Philip died of liver cancer in 1917. He was only 41 years old. He never got to see the Harlem Renaissance, this cultural and intellectual revival of black music, dance, art, literature, you name it. People partied into the night, even if the venues were whites-only audiences. They offered black entertainment from the likes of Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, Earl Hines, Coleman Hawkins, U.B. Blake. The list goes on and on. Sadly, the Great Depression crushed the Harlem Renaissance. That, and when Prohibition ended, nightlife declined drastically. However, Harlem is what it is today because one young man said to his dad that he didn't want to work in the family business anymore, and he bet on himself. So that's going to do it, folks. I've had a very busy couple of months as far as work is concerned. I will try to maintain a presence here on YouTube, but I do have other responsibilities 9 to 5 these days. So if you want to show the channel some love, you know what to do. Make sure to like the video, share it with your friends, with your family, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any uploads. Feel free to make channel donations as well via the super likes option. And as always, I'll catch you all in the next story. Deuces, kids.